Greetings and welcome to another edition of the AUHSD Future Talks. I'm your host, Michael Matsuda, the superintendent of the Anaheim Union High School District. And as our audience knows, this show is all about jobs, careers, and what education can do to better prepare our young people for the world of the future, which is upon all of us right now, especially as we enter a world post-pandemic with so many uncertainties and challenges ahead of us. We've been very blessed in this show to have amazing guests and leaders in education and in business, and from higher education institutions such as Stanford University. Our guest today is Dr Brazer from the Stanford School of Education, and like many of our guests, a long resume of accomplishments. And David also is the co-founder of a startup, TeachFX, which many districts are utilizing this amazing tool that helps measure oral language as well as critical thinking and collaboration and all of the 5 C's that our district is really trying to integrate into education. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. It's really an honor to be here. I appreciate your inviting me.
And can we hear a little bit just about you, David, and your sort of career leading up to Stanford and, working also in the field and in this area of leadership?
Sure. Well, I got my start in middle school teaching a long time ago. I prefer not to say the dates anymore. It's been a long time. I taught 5th through 8th graders in a peculiarly non-graded school. And then I moved on to teaching high school social studies, economics and U.S. history specifically. And during my teaching years, I really got the itch to want to lead schools. And so my first encounter with Stanford was as a graduate student in the 1980s. I worked with some amazing educators and organization theorists at Stanford, earning my PhD there. And then took the peculiar path from PhD to school administration, working as an assistant principal and principal in 2 different school districts on the San Francisco Peninsula. And after a period of time in school leadership, I wanted to work on returning to the research that I'd started as a graduate student, and also to preparing other school leaders. And so I had a 20-year career in higher education, first at George Mason University, where I taught and ultimately coordinated the education leadership program. And then I was at Stanford. I came back to Stanford to be the director of leadership degree programs, which included a leadership development for educators, as well as a joint degree between the business school and the School of Education. And I continue to work with Stanford in the Stanford Ed Leaders program, which is a professional development program for central office administrators who aspire to the superintendency. So that's a quick rundown on where I've been.
Well, it's an amazing career that you've had, and we at Anaheim Union High School District have benefited from your advice and consulting, for me personally too, in terms of how we are making the shift to better prepare young people for the world of work and careers, and ensuring that they have a purpose to all of this. But as you and I have talked about extensively, the foundation for organizations to continue to lead and to make these important pivots, especially during post-pandemic world where so much is uncertain, we have to be nimble. We have to have sort of organizational emotional intelligence. And this is all called a learning organization. We are, as with many districts, are beginning to move from a sort of a bureaucratic top-down to a learning organization. Can you help us define what that is, David?
Sure. I think you've named 2 or 3 of the critical elements. The first being the need for understanding the ambiguity and uncertainty around us. That provides a big part of the why. Why do you want to be a learning organization? Another big part is that there are needs to make positive change. And you referenced this in your comments just a moment ago, that the world is changing and schools need to change with it so that our students have the maximum opportunity to thrive after they leave our schools. And so when you think about these are things that we need to do, the question becomes, well, how do we do them? And I think that the learning organization responds to that question. And a learning organization is one that, let's just make it explicit, a school that takes an inquiry stance toward the problem of teaching and learning. And in taking that inquiry stance, is willing to make the changes necessary to have a more positive outcome for students. And that more positive outcome in Anaheim Union High School District is defined, at least in large part, by the CPSF. So for schools to be able to pursue the vision that's embodied in the CPSF, they need to understand what they're doing that is already on that pathway and what they need to do to complete their work on that pathway. And that's where the inquiry comes in. The answers to those questions are not simple. And so a learning organization does a lot of evidence gathering and a lot of evidence interpretation in order to understand what that world is that we're trying to respond to and what our status quo looks like that perhaps needs to change. Now,
so if I might just, a couple things. One, CPSF is the Career Preparedness Systems Framework, which really is our attempt to create cohesion around what we call the soft skills. We call it the 5 C's. Hard skills are the technical skills with dual credit aligned to a career. And the third piece is development of student voice and purpose, through the TED Talks and through civic engagement, and creating sort of an integrated approach to better prepare young people for their own careers with developing this authentic voice and purpose. So you would mention the importance of learning organizations, schools, school leadership teams, gathering evidence and making sense of that. How do you, that isn't that one of the challenge though, is that there's so much information coming in. How do you sort of prioritize that? And then, making sense of that, looking for patterns. And I think that's a big challenge right there, because sometimes our biases, sometimes we call it the mental models, right? Sometimes those come in the way because we make assumptions that are maybe not valid. Can you go a little bit deeper into that discussion?
Yes, I think it begins with finding a focus. In other words, we need to first decide what is it we want to learn about our school and how it's operating. For one school, the focus may be a lot more on the soft skills, that we feel as though our students really aren't prepared to take their roles as adults. For another school, it might be a lot more focused on the academic program and whether or not students are learning the kinds of skills, knowledge, and dispositions they need to learn in order to be successful graduates. So finding the focus is really the first important step. And then I think it's important to recognize that because of the complexity, that there needs to be subunits or teams that work on gathering and interpreting evidence that feed that evidence to the leadership team to make sense of the whole. No small group of people, I think, or any one individual can do all of this work on their own. But in addition to the need to have many hands, what happens in the analysis process, in the inquiry process, is that you start to build a common understanding of what the challenge is. And with that common understanding, that's where you start to build commitment.
So the common understanding, though, oftentimes begins with that common vision, right? Common vision and the alignment of that vision to the site vision, district vision, and then you have the site vision, which hopefully is all aligned. And you talked about the site teams then focusing on certain elements that would build on that vision, on their sight vision, right? And then
Yes.
gathering evidence around whatever that problem is or the challenge is. And, Peter Senge and others talk about this tension that is created because you're trying to reach that vision and then you have that your own reality. Where is that? And sometimes when um, so that tension, what according to Senge, and I'm sure you would agree, that tension is actually good, that you recognize it. The challenge is whether you're interpreting the evidence in a way that's really valid with what's real. Could you just share a little bit about how challenging that is?
Yes, I think that it begins with the the personal vision as opposed to reality. I shouldn't say as opposed. I'd rather say the personal vision in relationship to reality. That we're always striving toward achieving that personal vision, and doing so is our life's work. That's where the creative tension comes in. So that if I want to be an educator who is able to reach my student body equitably, I know that that's been a goal of lots of people for a long time. So I have to ask myself, why are we not there? And what can I do to help us get there? I think that when you take that to the organizational level, the same thing needs to happen in the collective. We have our school vision that is aligned with the district vision. We have this recognized need to make the kinds of shifts that would bring the CPSF alive. And we need to ask ourselves, why aren't we there yet? And in that creative tension, figure out ways to get there. The why questions are where the evidence becomes so important. There is the danger of people saying in order to make themselves feel okay or feel confident, to say, yes, we're already doing that. These are values that we hold and we're already there. I think in order to be a successful learning organization, individuals and the collective need to really push on that and say, well, what evidence do we have that we've already achieved this? They'll quickly find that there's lots to show that they haven't. And then the next question needs to be, well, how do we get there?
So don't you think that's pretty common, though, in education when, so this phrase, good is the enemy of the great, like, why do we need to change? Our test scores are already, really good. So why, how do you push against that when there's an assumption among the staff, and I'm talking to teachers, and it could be even the admin staff, who feel that, hey, we're already there. We're pretty good.
Well, I think it begins with your mental models. If your mental model is that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, then
Right.
You're not going to make change, because you can always define how what I'm doing now is better than risking what comes later. And so it probably early on needs a shift to say the world is changing and we need to change in a way that is responsive to those changes. Now, that's not easy to do, but again, I go to evidence. I think that when people see evidence of a different reality from the one they're carrying around in their current mental model, then they may be ready to make change. But that takes a lot of leadership and a lot of persuasion. And I have a device for thinking about that if you want to get into it.
Yes. Why don't you share that?
All right. Well, I am very taken with the metaphor of the four-room apartment. And in the four-room apartment, one of the rooms is denial. And people who reside in that room are always saying, no, you're wrong. It's really something else, whatever the educational issue might be. In the second room is more what I was describing, and that's the complacency room. And in the complacency room, people are essentially saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We're doing fine. Our test scores are fine. There's nothing to worry about or think about. Now, the leader's job, so to speak, is to entice people out of denial and complacency into the next room, which isn't very appealing, because that room is the confusion room. But we have to spend some time in confusion in order to see things differently, in order to shift our mental models, in order to really learn. We have to first be confused. And so the challenge is, how can I bring you into the confusion room in a way that doesn't feel like I'm disrupting your whole world, that I'm creating a situation where you can't function. Got to be very supportive in that confusion room, because once we work through our confusion, we can actually get to the fourth room, which is renewal. And I really think that that's where you're trying to take the district, Michael, is into the renewal room. And so principals and teacher leaders and everybody along the way needs to recognize that I might be in the complacency room or the denial room, and how am I going to get myself out of there? And then how am I going to help others make it into the confusion room and through that room to the renewal room?
How do you define renewal?
Renewal is that positive change that the learning organization is trying to make. So I like the phrase that you use in Anaheim, which is graduating students life ready. First of all, we need to know, what does that mean to be life ready? I think a lot of that has been set out in many different documents that you have. And so the understanding that is not as difficult as the understanding how to get there. And so we'll have renewal when teaching strategies in classrooms are aligned with that purpose of preparing students for life, which is hard skills and soft skills and so on. And we need to constantly be asking and checking to say, are we seeing that consistently across classrooms, across the school, and across the schools in the district?
You know, you are in a unique position as, you know, someone coming from Stanford and doing a lot of consulting and having a depth and breadth of experience with K-12 leadership. And I think we are really moving the cheese, as you might have talked about, with moving the creating a vision that's not so much focused on the traditional academic metric of college readiness, moving to careers in life. In fact, our new vision is to create a better world through the unlimited you. It says nothing about traditional vision goals. It's to create a better world through the unlimited you. And I would agree that we are moving pretty quickly. There are much, we have complacency, we have confusion, and we have, I think, increasing possible critical mass of teachers who are at renewal. There's a lot of really exciting things going on. How, for those who are kind of still stuck in the complacency and confusion area, how do you move them? How do leaders frame, what we're trying to do in ways that they can move?
A lot of it is understanding your audience. I think that there are many teachers who, while presently complacent, through their experience, understand that there are things that could be better. And it's a way of finding opportunities to help them do that work of improvement. I'll go into an example which I think makes this clear, at least for me. I had a social studies teacher who I would say was a very weak teacher, but he managed his classroom okay. He didn't create problems, and so everything went along for years without any issues. He started speaking up in faculty meetings about how the college prep program that had come to dominate the school wasn't serving lots of kids, and that bothered him. And so when I had an opportunity to create an academy for getting kids interested in the business world, I pulled them aside and I said, would you like to lead that academy? And he jumped at it. And that gave me an opportunity to spend a lot of time with him to develop new ways of thinking about teaching and learning that were more experientially based, less textbook based, and more grounded in preparing kids for life, although we didn't call it that, because that was an interest of his. And I think that leaders need to know those interests in their faculty in order to be able to tap into them and motivate teachers based on their aspirations to move in this direction of the vision of the school and the district?
You know, we've also talked about the urgency to bring this model to scale. And I think there's a lot of folks who are interested in what we're doing. What are, you know, I mean, if you look at the last 20 years, all these fairly young teachers, all they know is standardized testing. They don't know of a world without standards, which was most of American educational history. There were really no standards. There were no, I mean, teachers used to really create their own engaged lessons, right? Some amazing things that came out. How do we move the entire system beyond just the teaching to the test? How do we change all these people? Because to me, if you look at your four rooms, most of American public education is in the complacency room, I would say. That would be the place, the status quo. And they're going to return to the status quo after this pandemic because that's what they know.
I think you're absolutely right. And so I think it's incumbent upon leadership to ask really difficult questions to try to prod people out of that complacency room. So the first one where I'd start with is to say, all right, you're standards based. That's what you've been brought up in. And we've had persistent achievement gaps. You still have achievement gaps in your classroom. So what's your response to that? That would be one place to begin. Another place that I think is very important is to say, all right, so on the average, your students are doing okay. They're meeting standards. Let's leave aside the question of achievement gaps for the moment and look at what does achieving those standards really mean? Does that mean that a student is going to be successful? Well, probably not, because the standards actually don't align with what colleges and universities expect. And they don't really align very well in many regards with what the world of work or any other endeavor after graduation really expects. The standards are typically based on the achievement of curricula that may or may not actually help students succeed later in life. So what do you know about the student experience as they're going through your pursuit of those standards? Is that student experience helping them develop skills, knowledge, and dispositions that will serve them in whatever they choose to do after graduation, or are we just checking boxes?
Well, those are tough questions, right? Because we're used to checking boxes. That's the easier way out. Check boxes and wink and nod and everything's okay. So as you move from complacency to confusion, I could see people actually moving back to complacency, because the confusion too is you're just like, what is this all about? You know, in fact, we have teachers like that because we're trying to unyoke them from the pacing guides and all of that. We haven't done that for 6, 7, 8 years, and yet some department chairs, some teachers are still, that's what they do.
Yes.
And so how do you prevent them from sliding back into complacency when we want them to move from confusion to renewal?
I think that principals, assistant principals, 5Cs coaches, and department chairs, and all the different forms of leaders need to understand some things about stress and motivation and performance. And we've actually run a session on stress, motivation, and performance in some of the schools in Anaheim. But what Carl Weick observed over a lifetime of research in doing research on catastrophic situations is that when people are faced with stress, they abandon their most recent training and they go back to what they've done routinely for most of their careers. And that often leads to disaster. So you have to understand that first and make that explicit with people to say, look, I know that that teaching communication skills, that teaching collaboration and trying to build community in your classroom, it's going to break down at times. You're going to have these moments where your class just dissolved into chaos. I want you to know that that's an expected outcome, and you shouldn't feel defensive about that. But we need to keep pushing on these strategies and not go back to total control and no student responsibility, because then we abandon these goals that we've set for ourselves about helping kids to be life ready. And I want to be there for you as your department chair, as your 5Cs coach, or as your principal, to help you understand what went wrong and to try again, and to keep working at that until we develop new methods that really help us to achieve our vision.
How do organizations know that they've sort of become a learning organization? What should we be looking for in our leadership teams?
We should be looking for a willingness to take the long view, to know that change takes time. We should be looking for concrete evidence of meetings that were inquiry-based, where people came together to examine and analyze evidence, and over the long haul, to come up with solutions that address the root causes of why they're not meeting their goals or their vision. And there should be a de-emphasis, at least for principals, on all the managerial tasks that they tend to fill their time with. Because you can't be a learning organization that only thinks about managing the status quo. Those are in contradiction to each other. So there has to be space for really working on changing that status quo.
You know, I've done a lot of reading on this in terms of some of the outcomes, right? They talk about one of the benefits. There's a lot of benefits here about shared knowledge and strengthening your ability to problem solve. But one thing that pops up is the strengthening of community. That actually this could be fun stuff, right? Coming together where you feel valued, right? And you have a voice, those sort of things. And this is a very complex challenge for organizations. It's cultural. We're talking about cultural shifting going on, moving from one room to another to renewal. Could you comment a little bit about the benefits of this and what it means to have this sort of culture of a learning organization?
Well, I think you already named it, is that people feel greater motivation, greater commitment when they are energized by the new learning that they've experienced and the implementation of new ways of going about education. I think that there's a framework for how you build that, which is understanding the differences among work groups, teams, and communities of practice. And so a work group just gets a job done. A team, when it's functioning well, has multiple strengths from all of the different players, and it has very specific goals of achieving an outcome. A community of practice has those features, but from a more of a learning perspective. The purpose of a community of practice is for all the members of that community to learn new things together that help them to be more effective professionally. And so the way I look at it is that departments, cross-functional groupings, and whole schools can become communities of practice. But it's an ideal that is very different from the way that we think about people coming together right now. But I do believe that if we can generate some communities of practice within schools, they will be the engines of the learning that goes on in a learning organization.
Time flies, David, when we are having fun, and this has been quite informative for myself, and I'm sure it's going to be very informative for our audience of teacher leaders and admin leaders throughout our district and beyond. We have over 6,000 listeners now to these podcasts. So again, David, we're so blessed to have you as a thought partner with the Anaheim Union High School District, and we look forward to at least a few more of these conversations. I've always enjoyed them. Thank you.
Well, thank you for filling in the gaps that I left, and thank you for having me today. Appreciate it.